"Marry me," he said. But this isn't that story, or even a sequel to that story. You could consider it somewhat of a prequel, but really only in the sense that this story impacts every relationship story I've written since, even if only ever so slightly. On July 10th of 2007, while in training for a new job I had recently landed, I received a call from my doctor's office. I had been expecting this call, so I took it without hesitation. The doctor wanted to see me in person, the sooner the better, and he'd managed to make some time in the schedule for me that afternoon. Now, you can call your doctor, tell them you're bleeding from the eyeballs, you have one foot twisted at a 237-degree angle, and your heart hasn't beaten about 28 minutes, and they'll try to get you in a week from next Christmas. So when your doctor calls you and says, "I want to see you today," you move some stuff around. And so it was. I blew off my training for the rest of the day, I took the afternoon off work, and I paid my doctor a visit. Now, this was a family practice. I, being a single, young, mostly gay man, was not their target demographic, nor was I their typical patient. I didn't spend very long in the waiting room, and it took almost no time for the doctor to join me in the exam room. I could tell by the look on his face that this was going to be a difficult conversation for both of us. He started by explaining why it had taken so long for my results to come back. They test positive results a second time, just to be sure. My blood had tested positive for human immunodeficiency virus. Twice, it seemed. About that time, I wondered if he needed a hug. I doubted this was news he had to deliver too often at this type of practice. Now, I wouldn't say that this was something I was prepared for, and I certainly wouldn't say I was expecting it. But, as surprises go, this was a pretty weak one. I hadn't been tested in over 2 years. I had gone in for the test with the woman I'd recently been dating. She received her negative results in about a week. It took more than 2 for mine to come back. Also, I knew how sexually active I'd been. We'll just say I had my share and probably some of yours. Not that I was spending my weekends bathed in the blood of the unholy. No judgment if that's your thing. But I wasn't blind to the risks I had taken. They were small, mostly heat-of-the-moment risks, and I repented for every one. Jesus forgives, but apparently only Gilead heals. I wasn't a stranger to the concept of HIV, though I mostly only knew it as AIDS. It had been a shadowy presence over my life from an early age. Well, my formative years occurred during the 80s and in the 90s. The lessons of popular culture from that era, as I understand them, boil down to 3 things. Fuck is the greatest word in the English language. Cocaine is responsible for all of the world's problems. And AIDS will utterly destroy you. Also, I had an uncle who died from AIDS-related complications, so that's the sort of experience whose rattle is felt throughout the farthest limbs of the family tree. Now, I knew of my uncle more than I could say that I knew him firsthand. He existed mostly as a cautionary tale. Practice safe sex and don't be gay. That was the legacy that his existence left me with. Now, I was able to shake off the homophobia easily enough. That never made sense to me. But sex always both thrilled me and somewhat terrified me as I grew old enough to experience its pleasures and understand its consequences. That only made it more difficult to not be harsh with myself as I let the reality of the situation sink in that exam room. Though I'm sure I met him early on in my life, I never really got to know my Uncle Jimmy, though I did recently have an opportunity to sit down with my other uncle, his brother Donald, and discuss some of the circumstances surrounding Jimmy's life and death. Donald painted a picture of Jimmy that only a brother could, one simultaneously full of reverence and of his perfectly imperfect humanness. No doubt Donald saw his older brother as he was, fearless, never wavering in his sense of self, maybe a bit of a waif. But there was a clear kinship between the two of them that the 24 years between Jimmy's death and our conversation had done nothing to diminish. Jimmy was never in the closet. That's really the first thing that I learned about him. Donald said he could remember Jimmy openly running around with men, as he put it, as early as the age of 13. As Jimmy grew older, he learned to harness his sexuality to make his way in life. He could walk into a bar, pick a man up, go home with him, and that was where he lived. It lacked stability, but as far as Donald could tell, it was a life he was perfectly happy to be living. Jimmy was diagnosed with AIDS in or around 1989, and it forced him into a reckoning with his own mortality, as I think it still does for many of us today. But back then there was a certain practicality to that reckoning, maybe not as present today. Back then, AIDS meant almost certain death. There was a very small gap between the number of cases reported in the United States and the number of deaths attributed to the illness. Donald told me about a visit he had with Jimmy not long after his diagnosis, most of which Jimmy spent crying over his impending death. Jimmy had 2 years from diagnosis to death, and I asked if he ever found peace with his situation, because what a terrible place to spend your last 2 years. Thankfully, Donald said he did. Death from AIDS came, I suppose still comes, in many forms. For Jimmy, it ripped apart his spleen, causing a tear that painfully widened with every contraction and relaxation of the organ. For others, it looks like cancer. For others still, just a bad flu. See, it's not the HIV or the AIDS itself that kills you. It's whatever other disease takes advantage of the opportunity to invade an unguarded host. Now, one odd thing that I've come to notice about myself as I've accumulated life experiences is I have a special type of luck. I happen to have extremely good bad luck. My darkest clouds always seem to have platinum linings, and this was no different. Almost as a privilege of having been born when I was, I managed to take on the worst plague of the 20th century at a time when medical science had mostly succeeded at defanging it, at turning it into a mere condition, like diabetes, they would tell me repeatedly. One time my doctor told me that my chances of being hit by a bus were greater than my chances of dying from AIDS. Somehow that just made me feel like I had 2 new things to worry about. But I took the reassurance gracefully. As with any plague, stigma has always played a part in the HIV and AIDS epidemic, though the type of stigma associated with this illness has changed significantly over the course of 35 years. It persists, almost as an immedicable symptom of the disease itself. At the time of Jimmy's death, neither the patient nor the family associated themselves with the illness, even after it had run its course and the patient had been laid to rest. Publicly, the cause of death was always cancer, a bad flu, a ruptured spleen. All technically true, but still just another closet for the patient and the family. Today, though the stigma still exists, it's much more subtle. It's in the slut-shaming that inevitably makes its way to accusations of infection. It's in use of the word clean to describe somebody who's not infected. And it's in the would-be romantic conversations that get shut down at the point of disclosure. We now sit at a precarious point in history where the conversation around HIV and AIDS is concerned. It is unarguably not as dire as it once was. Still, it's so important that we not convey the message to our youth that it's no big deal, that we not pretend it doesn't exist. Without proper medical care, this disease can be just as deadly as it was in the 1980s. And proper medical care is expensive, time-consuming. It can be quite harsh on the body. So it's difficult to talk about HIV in a way that preserves the disease's well-earned sense of danger, but also maintains the dignity and social worth of those of us living with it. Talk about it we must, though, all of us. The more we pretend it doesn't exist, that it doesn't impact every single one of us, the more it permeates our community. I believe that the end of HIV and AIDS is inextricably linked to the end of the stigma surrounding it. Stigma begets shame, shame begets silence, and this disease gorges itself on our silence. We fill that silence with harmful reassurances. He doesn't look sick. It couldn't happen to me. My status is none of his business, and so on. That silence and those reassurances rob us of the opportunity to take the extremely simple steps necessary to protect ourselves and each other. It's really why I wanted to get up here and talk to you guys tonight. I've been in a loving monogamous relationship for almost 5 years, so I haven't had to disclose my status in a long time. I didn't have to disclose it to you all tonight. But I do hope that by doing so, I can serve as an example of how invisible HIV can be, but more than that, as an example of how each of us has the power to obliterate our own shame simply by not allowing it to silence us. I'm not ashamed to stand up here and tell you about the mistakes that I've made and what I've learned from them. My greatest hope is that all of you leave here better for it.
When you visited him, he was crying a lot. Did that last for the rest of the time, or did he at some point make some peace with that?
No, he made peace with it. Jimmy probably was the only one that accepted his fate, where the rest of the family were still thinking that he could get help, and you know, of course, that came along later, but it was a lot